On an afternoon in 1969, in a fortified tree line west of Saigon, a Viet Cong squad leader named Sang gave an order he had sworn to himself he would never give. He ordered his men to abandon a perfectly good position. In the middle of a fight they were winning, and run. They had spent 2 days preparing that position. It was a good one, a length of trench and bunkers dug into a tree line, well camouflaged, with clear fields of fire across a paddy. That morning, an American infantry platoon had walked into it exactly as Sang had hoped, and his men had opened up and pinned them down in the open. It was going well. The Americans were stuck, taking casualties, unable to move. By every rule Sang knew, this was the moment to press the advantage, not to run. And then he heard it, far off, and his blood went cold. It was a sound. A specific sound, one he had learned to fear more than any other in that war. A low, hard, chopping beat. Coming in fast from the east, not the round, heavy thumping of the troop helicopters, but something leaner and faster and meaner. A hammering slap that seemed to hit you in the chest before the aircraft was even in sight. Every man in that trench knew it, and the moment they heard it, the fight went out of them, because they knew exactly what it meant. It meant a Cobra was coming. And a Cobra coming toward a fixed position was not something you fought. It was something you survived if you were lucky, and the only way to survive it was to not be where it was looking. Sang could not know the names of the 2 men in that narrow aircraft slicing towards him, a pilot and a gunner, sitting one behind the other in a machine barely wider than a man. He knew only the sound and what it had done to positions like his before. So he gave the order. Get out. Leave the trench. Leave the good fields of fire. Leave the pinned Americans and get into the ground and away right now before the sound arrived. His men did not argue. They had heard it too. An entire prepared position full of fighting men who had the upper hand emptied itself into the jungle in less than a minute. Not because they were beaten, but because of a sound. That is what this story is about. Now, let me show you why a noise could do that to brave men. If a story like this matters to you, if the men who lived it on both sides deserve to be remembered, a like and a subscribe help it reach the people who care. It takes 1 second. These are the stories the history books leave out. Now, to understand why a sound could empty a trench full of men who were winning, you first have to understand what was making that sound. And you have to understand why it was different from everything else in that sky. To understand the fear, you first have to understand the machine, because the Cobra was unlike anything else flying over Vietnam, and it was unlike it on purpose. For the first years of the helicopter war, the Americans had improvised their gunships. They took the UH-1 Huey, the big, faithful workhorse that carried the troops and the supplies and the wounded, and they bolted guns and rocket pods onto it, and they called it a gunship, and it worked after a fashion. But it was a compromise. The Huey was a big, wide, relatively slow aircraft built to haul cargo, and turning it into a gun platform meant asking it to do a job it had not been designed for. It was too fat, too slow, and it could not carry as much weight of weapons as the mission really wanted. The Americans needed something built from the ground up for one job only: to bring death down onto a target and to survive doing it. The improvised Huey gunships had shown both the promise and the problem. The promise was obvious. A helicopter that could hover over a fight and pour fire onto the enemy was enormously useful, and the armed Hueys saved lives from the start. But the problem was just as clear. Load a Huey with enough guns and rockets and ammunition to matter, and it became heavy and sluggish. It could not carry a full load of weapons and still perform well. It was slow to get to the fight and slow once it got there. And its wide body made it easy to see and easy to hit, which was a serious problem for an aircraft whose job was to fly straight at people who were shooting. The Americans had learned exactly what they wanted from those improvised machines. Now they wanted it in a purpose-built form, an aircraft that carried nothing but weapons and the crew to fire them, that was fast enough to arrive quickly, agile enough to attack hard, and slim enough to survive the ground fire that the job demanded. That aircraft was the Cobra. What they built was the AH-1 Cobra. And the first thing to understand about it is its shape. Where the Huey was wide, the Cobra was impossibly thin. It was, from the front, barely wider than a man, a narrow blade of an aircraft, presenting almost no target to someone shooting at it head-on. The two crewmen did not sit side by side, as in almost every other helicopter. They sat one directly behind the other, in tandem, like a fighter jet, which is what allowed the fuselage to be so slender. The gunner sat in front, low, with the weapons. The pilot sat behind and slightly above him, looking over his head. Everything about the design was aimed at making the aircraft fast, agile, hard to hit, and absolutely bristling with firepower. Think about how strange it looked next to everything else in that sky. The Huey was a bus, wide, round-bodied, honest, built to carry people. The Cobra looked like a wasp, thin, hunched, all edges with stubby little wings that carried only weapons. It did not look like it was built to carry anything or help anyone. It looked like exactly what it was, a machine designed to hurt things and to be hard to hurt back, and it flew like it looked. The Cobra was fast, and it was agile in a way the fat Hueys were not. It could bank hard, dive, jink, come in low and fast, and pull off in a way that made it a genuinely difficult target. When it committed to an attack, it did not lumber. It came, and the narrowness that made it so slim from the front meant that in the very moment it was attacking you, coming head-on, nose down, guns tracking, it gave you almost nothing to shoot back at. It was, in the most literal sense, built to point itself at you and be nearly impossible to hit while it did. And the firepower was the point. The Cobra carried, in a turret under its chin, weapons that could be aimed independently of the aircraft, miniguns and grenade launchers. A minigun is not a normal machine gun. It is a multi-barreled weapon that spins and fires so fast that the individual shots blur into a single tearing roar, and the stream of bullets comes down so densely that it can saturate an area rather than simply hitting points in it. And under its stub wings, the Cobra carried rockets, pods of them, dozens, that could be fired in pairs or in devastating ripples, each one bursting with enough force to shred everything around where it landed. So picture what this machine actually was: a thin, fast, agile aircraft, hard to see and hard to hit, that existed for the single purpose of arriving over a target and destroying it with an overwhelming concentration of fire. It did not carry troops. It did not carry cargo. It carried death and nothing else, and it was very, very good at delivering it. That was the machine bearing down on Sang's Trench. And by 1969, every experienced fighter on the other side knew exactly what it was and exactly what it could do and exactly what its arrival meant for anyone caught in a fixed position beneath it. Now we come to the sound itself, because the sound is the whole heart of the story, and it deserves to be understood properly. Every helicopter makes noise, but helicopters do not all sound the same, and the men who fought in that war learned to tell them apart with their eyes closed. The big troop-carrying Huey made a sound that a whole generation now remembers, a deep, round, rhythmic thumping, the whop, whop, whop that means Vietnam to anyone who has seen a film about it. To the men on the ground, that sound could mean many things. It could mean reinforcements or supplies or the medevac coming for the wounded or the ride home. It was a heavy sound, but it was not, in itself, a sound of pure dread. The cobra sounded different, and the difference mattered enormously. Because of its shape, its speed, and the way it flew, the cobra produced a harder, sharper, more aggressive sound than the Huey. In certain conditions, especially when it was maneuvering or diving toward a target, its rotor produced a distinctive, hard slapping noise, a violent, chopping whack, whack, whack that was quite different from the round thumping of the transport helicopters. It was faster. It was harder edged. It had a quality that people who heard it described as somehow angrier, more menacing, a sound with intent in it, and it was often associated with the aircraft coming in fast and low, which made it seem to arrive suddenly, hammering out of nowhere. The men on the ground, on both sides, learned to distinguish that sound instantly, and their bodies learned to react to it before their minds had even caught up. Think about how finely tuned that ear became. A man who has lived under helicopters for a year does not hear a helicopter. He hears which one. He can tell a loaded Huey from an empty one. He can tell the transports from the gunships with his eyes shut in his sleep through jungle that hides the sky. It is the way a hunter knows bird calls, except that getting it wrong could kill him. So he learned fast, and he learned well. The sound arrived, and some deep, trained part of his brain sorted it in an instant. Friend, cargo, ignore, or gunship, danger, move. And the cobra's sound went straight to the bottom of that list, to the reflex level, below thought. A man did not hear the hard slap and then reason his way to fear. He heard it, and his stomach dropped, and his legs were already gathering under him before he had decided anything. That is what months of hard lessons do. They move a thing out of the mind and into the body, so that it happens faster than choice. The sound of the cobra had become, for these men, a pure reflex of survival. For an American soldier pinned down and in trouble, the hard slap of an approaching cobra was one of the most welcome sounds in the world. It meant that help was arriving, and that the situation was about to change violently in his favor. For a Viet Cong or North Vietnamese fighter in a fixed position, the exact same sound meant the exact opposite. It meant that the worst thing that could happen was now happening, and that the clock had just started, and that every second he stayed where he was brought him closer to death. This is the thing to understand about the sound. It was not just a noise that indicated an aircraft was near. It had become, through hard experience, a signal, a piece of information that arrived faster than sight, that could not be hidden from, that reached into a trench or a bunker or a stretch of jungle and told every man there exactly what was coming. You could camouflage your position from the eye. You could hide from the spotter planes under the canopy. But you could not unhear the cobra. The sound found you wherever you were. And it told you the truth. And the truth was that you now had a choice to make very quickly about whether you were going to live. And the sound almost always came first. That was part of its power. Under the jungle canopy, you often could not see the sky at all, let alone a fast, low aircraft weaving in toward you. So the eye was useless, and the ear was everything. The hard slap would come rolling in over the trees, and you would know a cobra was near and coming without ever having seen it, which meant the fear arrived before the target did, in the worst possible order. You could not watch it approach and judge whether it had seen you. You could only hear that it was there, somewhere, hunting, and decide what to do with a few seconds of warning and no way to know how many seconds you actually had. That uncertainty was its own kind of pressure. Was it coming for you or passing by? Had it seen your position or not? You could not tell from the sound alone. And so the safe answer, the one experience taught, was to assume the worst every time. Hear the Cobra and move. Do not wait to find out whether this was the past that had your name on it. The men who waited to be sure were the men who found out too late. And the men who had survived that choice before had all learned the same answer. When you hear that sound, you do not stay and fight it. You get into the earth, or you get away, and you do it now, because the sound was not the danger. The sound was the warning that the danger was seconds away, and the men who ignored the warning did not usually get a second one. To understand why brave, disciplined, well-armed men would abandon a good position at a sound, you have to understand the specific, hopeless problem that a cobra presented to a fighter on the ground. Because these were not cowards. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese were some of the most determined fighters of the century, men who stood up to bombers and artillery and did not break, and yet the Cobra emptied their trenches. The reason is worth understanding exactly. The core of the problem was this: against a Cobra attacking a fixed position, there was almost nothing useful you could do. Every option was bad. Start with the obvious one, shoot it down. In theory, a Cobra was not invulnerable. Small arms fire and anti-aircraft guns did bring them down over the course of the war, and the men who flew them knew the risk intimately. But shooting down a Cobra that was attacking you was a desperate proposition for reasons we have explored in other stories. To fire at it, you had to reveal your position, and revealing your position to a Cobra was very close to suicide, because now the aircraft, built for precisely this, knew exactly where you were and could bring its full, overwhelming firepower directly onto that spot. And the Cobra was a hard target. Thin, fast, agile, presenting almost nothing to aim at when it was coming head-on, which was exactly how it came when it was attacking. You were trying to hit a fast, narrow, jinking target while it was bringing a storm of miniguns and rockets down on you. The odds were not in your favor, and everyone knew it. Then there was the option of staying put and taking cover. This was better sometimes, but against a Cobra, it was often not enough because of what the Cobra carried. A well-dug bunker could protect you from a lot, but the Cobra's rockets could tear apart a tree line, and its miniguns could saturate an area so completely, putting so many rounds into so small a space in so short a time, that cover which would have protected you from ordinary fire could be overwhelmed. And crucially, the Cobra could loiter. It could circle and come back and work a position over methodically, pass after pass, for as long as its ammunition lasted. Simply hiding and hoping was a bet against a patient, circling machine that was specifically designed to dig you out of exactly the cover you were hiding in. And then there was the deeper problem, the one that made the Cobra so much worse than the artillery or the bombers those men had already learned to endure. The bombs and the shells were, in a terrible way, impersonal. They fell on an area, they either hit you or they did not, and there was nothing to be done but endure them and trust to luck. But the Cobra was not impersonal. It could see. It had a man in it, a gunner, looking down, choosing targets. The Cobra did not saturate a grid square and leave. It came looking for you specifically, and it could adjust and follow and hunt. Enduring artillery was a matter of luck. Enduring a Cobra was a matter of whether a man in the aircraft happened to spot you, and if he did, luck had very little to do with what came next. Picture a single gun run from the ground, and you understand why they ran. The Cobra rolls in. It noses down toward the tree line, and his sound changes. The slap sharpens, hardens as it dives, and then the front of the aircraft seems to light up, and there is a noise like nothing else on a battlefield. Not a rattle of individual shots, but a single tearing roar as the minigun pours thousands of rounds a minute into a space the size of a room. The ground erupts. Dirt, splinters, everything chewed up in a line that walks across the earth wherever the gunner points it. And then the rockets? Pairs of them streaking down, each one bursting with a crack that flattens everything around it. And then the aircraft is climbing away and banking and coming around again. That is the part that breaks a position, not the first pass, the knowledge that there will be a second and a third, and that the machine can keep this up, circling and firing for as long as its ammunition lasts, methodically taking the tree line apart one length at a time. A man in a bunker can grit his teeth through one pass. It is the circling that empties him. The certainty that the thing is not going to leave and is going to keep working the ground until it finds him. So put all of that together, and you can see the trap the fighter on the ground was in. He could not reliably shoot the Cobra down, and trying revealed him. He could not reliably hide from it because it could saturate his cover and loiter to hunt him. He could not endure it the way he had learned to endure the shelling, because it was aimed and patient and personal. Every option that had worked against every other threat in that war failed against this one. And so, over time, the fighters on the ground arrived at the only answer that actually worked, the one Sung reached for in his trench. Do not be there. The single reliable defense against a Cobra was to not be where it was looking when it arrived, and the sound was the thing that told you it was time to go. Think about how much that cost them, tactically, and you see how bad the problem was. Their whole strength was the prepared position, the trench dug just so, the guns sighted to cover the killing ground, the ambush weeks in the making. That was how a lightly armed force beat a heavy one. Pick the ground, prepare it, and make the enemy come to you, and the Cobra took it away. Because the one defense that worked against the gunship was to abandon the prepared position, which meant abandoning the very thing that gave them their advantage. The sound did not just make them run. It made them give up the ground they had chosen, the work they had done, the ambush they had built, all of it in a minute at a noise. That is an expensive thing to be forced to do over and over, and it shaped the entire way they had to fight. Here is where the story becomes something more interesting than a scary, machine-frightened people. Because what the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese actually did in response to the Cobra was not panic. It was the opposite of panic. It was one of the most disciplined tactical responses of the entire war, and it deserves real respect. Breaking contact, deliberately disengaging from a fight and withdrawing, is one of the hardest things an army can do well. It is easy to attack, and it is possible to defend. But to be in a fight, and to decide to leave it and to leave in good order without dissolving into a rout, requires enormous discipline. And the Viet Cong and NVA became masters of it out of necessity because against American firepower, knowing when and how to leave was often the only thing that kept them alive. The Cobra and the air power it represented forced them to build this skill to an extraordinary degree. They developed a whole doctrine around the brevity of their engagements. The idea was to hit hard, fast, at close range, and then to be gone before the full weight of the American response, the gunships, the artillery, the fast jets, could arrive. They did not want long battles. A long battle was a battle the Americans would win, because time was what let the Americans bring their overwhelming firepower to bear. So the Viet Cong learned to fight in short, violent bursts, and then to vanish. And the arrival of the Cobra was very often the signal that the burst was over and the vanishing had to begin. This is why hugging the belt became such a central tactic for them. staying as close as possible to the American troops during a fight. Part of the reason was that if you were close enough to the Americans, they could not use their heavy firepower without hitting their own men, but it also fed directly into the disengagement. Fight close, fight fast, and then break away and disappear into the terrain in the narrow window before the sky opened up. The whole rhythm of their war was built around the knowledge that they could not stay, that staying meant dying, and that the aircraft would always come. And so, the response to the Cobra's sound was drilled and practiced and disciplined. When the gunships were heard, the men knew what to do, and they did it fast and in order. Break contact. Get into the prepared escape routes, the tunnels, the trails, the stream beds, the covered ways they had built precisely for this. Disperse, so there was no concentration for the aircraft to hammer. Get under the deepest cover available. Disappear. An observer watching a Viet Cong position empty out at the sound of an approaching Cobra was not watching men break and run in terror. He was watching a trained response, executed by disciplined soldiers who had learned, through bitter experience, exactly how long they had and exactly what to do with that time. Watch it happen, and it does not look like fear at all. The sound comes in from the east, a word goes down the trench. Not a scream, a word. And the position comes apart in a fast, practiced order. The gunners strip their weapons off the mounts. Men grab what they can carry and leave what they cannot. They do not bunch up, because bunching up is what the aircraft wants. They spread out, each man or pair to a different route. They drop into the communication trenches, the stream bed, the tunnel mouth, the covered trail they dug weeks ago for exactly this. And in under a minute, the tree line that was full of fighting men is empty. No target, no concentration, nothing for the gunship to find, but an abandoned trench. That is not a rout. A rout is men throwing away their weapons and running blind. This was the opposite. Weapons kept, order kept, routes followed, the whole thing rehearsed until it was automatic. They had turned the act of disappearing into a drill, as practiced as any assault. The Cobra had taught them to do it, and they had learned the lesson so well that the disappearing itself became a kind of weapon. The thing that kept them alive to fight another day on ground of their own choosing when no gunship was in the sky. There is a real and painful irony in this, and it is worth naming. The thing that emptied the trenches was not cowardice. It was, in its way, a kind of professionalism, a clear-eyed recognition of a threat that could not be beaten, and the disciplined execution of the only response that worked. The men who ran from the Cobra's sound were very often the same men who would stand and fight almost anything else. They ran from the Cobra because running from the Cobra was the correct, professional, survivable thing to do, and because the men who did not learn to run from it did not live long enough to fight anything else. Turn it around now and look at the war from inside that thin aircraft slicing towards Sang's trench, because the Cobra's power did not come from the machine alone. It came from the two men in it, and what they did was harder and more dangerous than the fear on the ground might suggest. The Cobra had a crew of two sitting one behind the other in that impossibly narrow fuselage. In the back and slightly up sat the pilot, who flew the aircraft and also had control of the rockets. In the front, low in the nose, sat the co-pilot gunner who operated the chin turret with its miniguns and grenade launcher. The two men worked as a single organism, and the job demanded a tight, practiced coordination between them, often in the middle of taking fire, with the lives on the ground depending on their getting it exactly right. And here is the thing that the fear on the ground can obscure. The Cobra crews were not safe. Flying a gunship in Vietnam was one of the most dangerous jobs in the war. To attack a ground position effectively, the Cobra had to come in close and press the attack, and expose itself to everything the enemy could throw up at it. The crews flew into concentrated ground fire deliberately, repeatedly, because that was the only way to do the job. Many Cobras were hit. Many were shot down. The men who flew them knew the risks precisely, and they went in anyway, again and again, because on the ground below them, very often, were American soldiers who were going to die if the gunship did not come. Because that was the real purpose of the Cobra, underneath all the firepower. It was there to save the men on the ground. This is the part that connects to every other story we have told. When an American infantry unit was pinned down, in trouble, being overrun, the Cobra was the answer to their prayers. It could arrive fast, and it could bring a concentration of fire that could break an enemy assault, and it could keep coming back. Time and again, gunships turned the tide of a fight that was going badly for the men on the ground, arriving in the last moments before a position was overrun and shattering the attack with rockets and minigun fire. The infantry loved the Cobra crews with a fierce and simple gratitude because those crews flew into terrible danger on demand to save them. Picture it from the ground. On the American side, and you see the whole thing flip. A platoon is pinned in the open, taking fire from a tree line, men down, unable to move, the volume of fire building in a way that means the enemy is about to rush them. They have called for help, and now they are just trying to stay alive until it comes. And then, over the noise of the firefight, they hear it, that hard, chopping slap coming in fast from behind them. To them, it is the most beautiful sound in the world, because they know exactly what it means too. It means the tree line that is killing them is about to become the most dangerous place in the valley. The Cobra comes over their heads, low, and rolls in on the enemy, and the minigun opens up with that tearing roar, and the rockets go in. And the fire that was pinning the platoon suddenly slackens, because the men in that tree line have just heard the same sound and are doing exactly what Sang's men did, getting out. The gunship has not just added firepower, it has changed the whole shape of the fight in 10 seconds, turned the hunters into the hunted, and given a trapped platoon its life back. That is why the infantry loved them. Same sound, same aircraft, same two men, salvation on one side of the tree line, and flight on the other. So the same aircraft that emptied the Viet Cong trench with its sound was, at that very moment, the most beautiful sight in the world to the American platoon pinned down in the paddy. The hard slapping beat that meant death and flight to Sang's men meant rescue and hope to the Americans they had trapped. The two crewmen in that narrow aircraft were, in the same instant, the most feared thing in the sky to one group of men and the most welcome to another. And they earned both reputations the same way, by flying a thin, overgunned aircraft straight into the fight and doing a dangerous job with a skill and a courage that both sides in the end came to respect. Sang survived that day and the war because he had learned the lesson the sound was teaching and he had the discipline to act on it. Many did not. And late in his life, an old man now, he would talk about the sound of the gunships as one of the things from that war that had never entirely left him. He did not remember the Cobra as a coward's nightmare, and he bristled at the idea that running from it had been cowardice. He and his men had run from it, yes, over and over, but they had run the way a professional runs from a thing that cannot be fought, deliberately in order to fight again another day. He was proud of that discipline, and he had a right to be, because it had kept his men alive against an enemy who could otherwise have destroyed them. The Cobra had not broken them. It had taught them at a terrible price to be some of the most disciplined light infantry in the world, masters of the quick fight and the clean disappearance. But he was honest, too, about what the sound had done to him and to men like him over the years. It had worn something down. To live under a sky that could, at any moment, produce that hard chopping beat and everything it promised. To know that no position was ever truly safe, that any fight might end with the gunships and the desperate scramble to get away, was exhausting in a way that is hard to convey. It bred a permanent wariness, an ear always half-cocked for that specific sound, a readiness to abandon everything and run at a moment's notice. A man cannot live like that for years and be entirely untouched by it. The sound got into them, and it stayed. And he came, in the end, to a grudging respect for the men who had flown those machines. He understood, as only an enemy can, what it had cost them to come in the way they did. Thin aircraft flying straight into everything his side could throw at them, again and again, to bring that fire down. He knew the gunships had not been invulnerable. He had seen them hit. He had seen them fall. And he knew that the men inside them had understood the risk perfectly well and had come anyway, because on the ground below, there were men they were trying to save. That was not something he could hate in the end, however much the sound had frightened him. It was something he recognized because it was the same thing that made his own men run in good order and come back to fight. A hard professionalism in service of the men beside you in the worst place on earth. The sound, though, the sound stayed with him to the end. Decades later, in a country at peace, an old man would sometimes hear a helicopter pass overhead. An ordinary, harmless helicopter on some ordinary errand. And for just an instant, before his mind caught up, his body would tense, and some ancient part of him would tell him to get into the ground and away. That was what the Cobra had left him, not a wound you could see, a reflex buried deep that a sound could still trigger 50 years later. And he was not alone in that. Across 2 countries and a whole generation, men carried the same buried thing. American veterans, too, would tense at the beat of a passing helicopter, though for many of them the memory pulled a different way. On one side of that old war, the sound had meant run. On the other, it had meant hold on, help is coming. But it had marked all of them. A sound that powerful, learned that hard, does not fade. It goes into the body, and it stays for life, and it waits. And now and then, an ordinary helicopter on an ordinary day reaches down through 50 years and touches it. And for one instant, these old men are young again, and back in the worst place they ever were. Here is what the sound of the Cobra really was, and why it could do what no ordinary weapon could: empty a trench full of brave men who were winning. Most weapons frighten you when they hit you. The Cobra frightened you before it arrived, and that is a different and more powerful thing, because the sound arrived ahead of everything, and it told the truth. It was a piece of information that came faster than sight, impossible to hide from, and it told every man who heard it a simple and terrible thing. The machine you cannot fight is coming, and you have seconds to decide what to do about it. A weapon that hurts you is a problem. A weapon whose mere approaching sound tells you that you have already lost the fight. That is something else. That is a weapon that wins before it fires, and it won because of what it had proven over and over to the men who heard it. The sound was frightening only because the reality behind it was real. Those men had seen what a Cobra did to a fixed position. They had watched cover fail and trenches be torn apart and positions they thought were strong be systematically dismantled from the air by a patient, circling machine they could not reach. The sound carried all of that memory in it. When Song's men heard the hard, slapping beat coming in from the east, they were not frightened of a noise. They were remembering everything that noise had meant every other time, and they were choosing wisely not to add themselves to the list of men who had stayed to find out. So they ran, and the running was not weakness. This is the thing to carry away from the story, because it is easy to get wrong. An army that abandons a good position at a sound sounds at first like an army that has been broken. But the Viet Cong who emptied that trench had not been broken. They had been educated. They had learned at enormous cost the one lesson that kept them alive under a sky that belonged to their enemy, that some things cannot be fought, only avoided, and that the mark of a professional is knowing the difference. They ran from the Cobra the way a sailor runs from a storm he cannot outfight, not in panic, in respect, in the hard, clear knowledge of exactly what they were dealing with. And the men in the narrow aircraft earned that respect the hard way by flying into everything the ground could throw at them to bring that fire down, and dying in their share of thin, overgunned machines to save the men below. The sound that emptied the trenches was the same sound that saved the pinned-down platoon. It was terror to one side and rescue to the other, and it was made by the same two brave men in the same thin aircraft doing the same dangerous job. They spent 2 days building that position, and they were winning the fight, and they gave it all up and vanished into the jungle because of a sound coming in from the east. Not because they were cowards, because they had learned what that sound meant, and the men who did not learn it did not live to tell anyone. That is why the sound of a Cobra gunship could empty an entire trench full of fighting men in less than a minute. Now you know why. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. These are the histories worth keeping, not just the famous battles with their famous names, but the sounds and the reflexes and the hard lessons that shaped the men who lived that war on both sides of the wire. If it meant something to you, genuinely it helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of history matters, and it helps these videos find the people who care about them. If you're not subscribed yet, now is a good time. Hit subscribe and the bell so you never miss a new one. I would love to know where you are watching from today, and if someone in your family served in Vietnam, a Cobra pilot, a door gunner, a grunt who was saved by a gunship, anyone in any unit, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men carried a story like the one you just heard. Most of them never told it. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten.